He thought his robe and his titles would protect him. He thought his silver hair and his weary smile could silence questions. But in less than 30 seconds, before millions of watching eyes, a woman in a black suit and a single gold pin shattered the illusion. That woman was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The air inside Studio 4B that night felt heavy, as if it had been waiting all day to break. The lights were cold, the table polished, the chairs arranged just so. Everything looked perfect. But something in the room whispered that perfection was about to crack. This was not just another program. This was State of Justice Live, broadcast from a studio outside Columbus, Ohio. For years, it had been a stage where judges, lawyers, and politicians rehearsed the same arguments about law and order. Calm voices, measured tones, nothing that threatened the foundation. But tonight was different. At one end sat Jasmine Crockett, the daughter of a community that had been told for centuries to wait, to be patient, to let justice arrive on someone else's timetable. She did not wear patience anymore. She carried the weight of her people's silence and the fire of their memory. Before she entered Congress, she had been a civil rights attorney, walking into courtrooms, no camera ever visited, defending names that judges did not even bother to pronounce correctly. She carried those forgotten voices with her into that studio. Across from her sat Judge Roland Wexler, retired, but still clinging to the authority of the bench. He had built a career on rulings that sent young men to prison for first mistakes, on sentences that crushed families who could not pay bail. To his supporters, he was a symbol of toughness. To his critics, he was the cold face of a system that confused punishment with justice. The cameras blinked alive. The host smiled. Millions leaned closer to their screens, expecting another panel, another polite exchange. Instead, they saw sparks catch fire. Jasmine spoke first. Her voice did not tremble. She named the injustices hidden in plain sight. A 17-year-old, given 15 years for stealing a car. A mother jailed, because the bus never came. Defendants crushed, not by crime, but by poverty. She said the words many had waited to hear. They say the law is blind. Too often, it is only blind to suffering. Wexler smiled thinly. He called her words emotional, accused her of confusing politics with the law. He thought his dismissal would close the matter, but it did not. It opened a wound. And then it happened. Jasmine looked at him, not with anger, but with a calm that cut deeper than rage. She reminded him that she had studied judicial restraint, that she had written briefs on the desks of appellate judges long before she ran for office. She reminded him, and the millions watching, that she was not there by accident. She had earned her place. The room shifted. The mask slipped. For the first time, Wexler's authority felt fragile. What followed would ignite a movement, trend, across the nation, and shake the walls of institutions that had stood untouched for decades. But in that opening moment, it was simply this: a woman in a suit, a microphone, and a mind sharp as a blade, standing against a man who thought no one could ever challenge him. And so the question rose, heavy and electric: when truth finally finds its voice, what power can truly stand against it? Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Studio 4B, the story of injustice had already been written in the lives of her people. To understand the weight she carried that night, one must travel back through the corridors of American history, where the scales of justice were rarely balanced and the gavel too often fell hardest on black shoulders. The United States has long proclaimed itself as the land of liberty, yet in courtrooms across the nation, liberty was measured not by truth but by skin color, wealth, and the quiet prejudices of men in robes. In the 19th century, the infamous ruling in Dred Scott verse, Sanford declared that people of African descent could never be citizens of the Republic. In the 20th century, the so-called era of civil rights was shadowed by mass incarceration. Black men who marched for freedom in Selma saw their sons shackled for minor infractions in Birmingham and Chicago. Justice was a promise, but punishment was the practice. This was the soil in which Jasmine Crockett grew, not simply as a woman of color in America, but as a student of history who knew that silence never protected the vulnerable. She read the case files where defendants disappeared into prison for non-violent offenses, and she listened to mothers describe how judges dismissed them as though they were interruptions rather than human beings. Every story carried the same refrain. The law claimed to be blind, yet it always seemed to see color. By the late 20th century, the so-called war on drugs had transformed entire communities into battlegrounds. Judges like Roland Wexler built careers during this era. Tough on crime was the slogan. Mandatory minimums became the weapon. Prosecutors wielded statistics like shields, insisting that harsh sentencing created safety. But safety for whom? For the suburbs shielded by distance, or for the communities hollowed out by fathers and brothers sent away for decades? Wexler himself rose in this climate. His rulings became examples cited in law schools as demonstrations of judicial firmness. He believed, as many in his generation did, that fear was a tool to maintain order. He used it liberally, reminding defendants that respect was earned not through fairness, but through obedience. The appellate courts overturned some of his decisions, but not enough to shake his throne. For decades, men like him ruled courtrooms like kingdoms, yet outside those courtrooms, the tide of history shifted, from the marches in Montgomery to the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., from the defiance of Rosa Parks to the campaigns of Shirley Chisholm. A tradition of resistance grew. Black voices in Congress rose slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but they rose. Each voice was another crack in the wall of silence. By the time Jasmine Crockett arrived in Washington, she carried not only her own experiences, but the legacy of those who had spoken before her. She knew the numbers. Studies showed that African Americans received longer sentences than white defendants for the same crimes. She knew that bail was set disproportionately high, trapping the poor behind bars before trial. She knew that families were broken not by violence alone, but by the cold efficiency of a system designed to process rather than to protect. These were not abstractions. They were lived realities for her constituents, for her neighbors, for the people who elected her to stand in their name. And so, when Jasmine Crockett sat across from Roland Wexler that evening, she was not simply debating policy. She was carrying centuries of silence into a moment of sound. The cameras did not just capture two people on opposite sides of a table, they captured the collision of two Americas, one that believed authority was unquestionable, and one that believed truth could no longer be deferred. The roots of that clash stretched deep. In the 18th century, black bodies were sold in the name of law. In the 19th century, black testimony was dismissed in courts as unreliable. In the 20th century, the prison industrial complex swallowed generation after generation. And in the 21st century, voices like Jasmine Crockett's insisted that enough was enough. She had not come from wealth. She had not been handed her seat. She earned it through years of grinding work as a civil rights attorney, walking into legal battles that others avoided. She represented clients whose names never appeared in newspapers, whose cases never made headlines, whose lives would have been erased if not for someone willing to fight. In those folding chair courtrooms, she learned the truth. Wexler could never admit that justice is not measured by efficiency, but by humanity. When she entered Congress, many thought she would blend quietly into the machinery of Washington. They underestimated her. They did not see the steel sharpened by years of struggle. They did not hear the echoes of mothers she had once comforted in kitchens, dimmed by eviction notices. They did not recognize that her voice was not hers alone, but the chorus of a community demanding to be heard. And so the stage was set. On one side, Roland Wexler, the old guard, the embodiment of judicial arrogance. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, the new voice, the inheritor of a legacy that stretched from slavery to civil rights to the halls of Congress. Between them, a nation still struggling to decide whether justice meant punishment or fairness, silence or truth. The confrontation that would unfold in Studio 4B did not appear out of nowhere. It was the harvest of seeds planted long ago in chains, in marches, in whispered prayers, in shouted protests. It was history demanding its reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett, with her suit, her microphone, and her unflinching resolve, was the answer. Before Jasmine Crockett stood before the cameras, before hashtags carried her name across the nation, she was a young woman in a courtroom that smelled of dust and exhaustion. She had chosen a path that many warned against. Civil rights law, a battlefield where victories were rare and the wounds unending. But Jasmine did not measure her work in victories. She measured it in the faces of those who had no one else to fight for them. Her earliest cases were not the kind that filled headlines. They were quiet tragedies, buried in back pages or ignored entirely. A teenager accused of shoplifting because he wore the wrong hoodie in the wrong shop. A mother fined into debt because she missed a hearing she could not afford to attend. A young man whose only crime was standing in the wrong place when police arrived. To others, these cases were small. To Jasmine, they were everything, because each one was a life balanced on the edge of a system that cared little for fairness. She learned quickly that courtrooms were not neutral grounds. The wood paneling, the flags, the solemn rituals of rising for the judge, all of it projected authority, but beneath the surface, bias thrived. Prosecutors joked with judges over coffee. Defendants sat shackled, waiting for mercy that rarely came. The gap between the language of justice and the practice of punishment was wide, and Jasmine walked that gap every day. The challenges were relentless. She faced condescension not only from opposing counsel, but from the very benches meant to embody impartiality. Judges interrupted her, questioned her knowledge, dismissed her as inexperienced. Yet every slight sharpened her resolve. She studied late into the night, reading the very rulings that sought to belittle her, dissecting their logic, until she could wield the law like a blade. Her reputation grew in whispers first. Public defenders knew she could be trusted. Families spoke her name with gratitude in church halls. Community leaders began to call, asking her to take on cases. Others refused. She did not seek the spotlight. She sought the truth, and in doing so, she became a light in places, long left in shadow. But light attracts resistance. With every case she won, with every injustice she exposed, the establishment pushed back. She was told to slow down, to temper her tone, to remember her place. But Jasmine had no intention of being silent. She knew the history of women who had been told the same. Sojourner, Truth, who declared her own humanity in the face of disbelief. Shirley Chisholm, who entered Congress, unbought and unbossed. Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat. Jasmine saw herself as part of this lineage, and she refused to step aside. Her decision to enter politics was not born from ambition, but necessity. She had seen too many lives undone by laws written far from the neighborhoods they affected. She knew that change could not only be fought case by case, it had to be written into policy, into the very structure of the system. Running for office was another courtroom, another battle, but one she could not ignore. The campaign was brutal. Opponents painted her as radical, unfit, inexperienced. She was underestimated, dismissed as a protest candidate. But she knocked on doors, spoke in community centers, listened in kitchens where light bulbs flickered above tables, covered in overdue bills. She did not promise miracles. She promised to listen, to fight, to carry the voices that had been ignored. That promise was enough. She won. In Washington, the challenges multiplied. She walked into halls where portraits of white men lined the walls, where power was measured not by truth, but by tradition. She was told again to wait her turn, to learn the rules before speaking too loudly. But Jasmine had already learned the most important rule: silence protects the system, not the people. And so, when the invitation came to appear on State of Justice Live, she accepted. Some advisors warned her it was a trap. The program had a reputation for giving retired judges and seasoned politicians a stage to defend the status quo. Facing Judge Roland Wexler was no small matter. His career spanned decades. His rulings had shaped the lives of thousands. His voice carried the weight of authority. But Jasmine knew the truth about authority. It is only as strong as the silence it commands. She prepared, not with sound bites, but with facts. She read through Wexler's rulings, the appellate reversals, the ethical complaints buried in legal briefs. She memorized cases, not as statistics, but as stories. The teenager sentenced beyond reason, the mother jailed for poverty, the defendants punished for being poor rather than guilty. She carried them all with her, ready to speak, not just as a congresswoman, but as a witness to suffering. On the night of the broadcast, as the makeup artists powdered her skin and the producers whispered into headsets, Jasmine sat still. She thought of her first case, of that young boy accused of theft because of the hoodie he wore. She thought of the mother who cried in her office because a missed bus had cost her freedom. She thought of all the lives folded into case numbers, forgotten by everyone, except those who loved them. She straightened her jacket, adjusted her microphone, and exhaled. Whatever happened in Studio 4B, she knew this. She was not walking in alone. She carried her community, her history, her ancestors, and she would not be silenced. The stage was set. The lights burned bright. Roland Wexler leaned back in his chair, convinced of his superiority. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, armed with truth. The journey that had begun in forgotten courtrooms was about to collide with national television, and history was ready to listen. The cameras rolled. The theme music faded. Across the nation, screens lit up in living rooms, diners, bus stations, even in small shops, where the volume was kept low, but eyes stayed fixed. Viewers expected another hour of dry policy talk. What they received was something closer to a trial, one in which not only Judge Roland Wexler's words, but his very legacy, would stand. Accused. Host Monica Fields welcomed the audience with practiced warmth. Tonight we are joined by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and former Judge Roland Wexler. We will be discussing judicial independence, mandatory minimums, and the future of accountability in America's courts. Her tone carried no hint of what was to come. She turned to Jasmine first. Congresswoman, you have been outspoken about systemic bias within our courts. Where does reform begin? Jasmine leaned forward. She did not shuffle her notes or glance at the cameras. Her voice was calm, her cadence deliberate. It begins with accountability, and not the kind that comes after a tragedy or a viral headline. It begins in the daily decisions, the bonds set too high, the evidence ignored, the patterns that remain unnamed, because naming them would force change. She gave examples. A 17-year-old sentenced to 15 years for stealing a car, a mother jailed for missing a court date when her bus never arrived. Defendants punished not because they were dangerous, but because they were poor. Each case struck like a hammer, not with noise, but with weight. Wexler's foot, which had been tapping lazily. Still, he folded his hands across his lap and offered a thin smile. His reply dripped with condescension. That is a moving perspective, Congresswoman. But with all due respect, courtrooms are not therapy offices. Judges deal. In fact, not feelings. We cannot bend the law every time someone cries on the stand. Judges are servants of the law. We do not indulge in politics. The words were meant to dismiss, to shrink her down to the role of an emotional novice. But Jasmine did not blink. She allowed the silence to stretch, long enough for the smugness of his words to hang heavy. Then she answered, Judge Wexler, I studied judicial restraint under professors who helped write the very texts you assign in seminars. I clerked in federal courtrooms. I wrote briefs that landed on appellate judges' desks long before I entered Congress. So let us not pretend I arrived here by accident. A shift swept through the room. It was invisible, but undeniable. Even Monica glanced up from her notes, startled. The crew behind the cameras exchanged quick looks. Jasmine's words carried no raised volume, but they cut like steel. She pressed further. I once believed the bench was sacred, that judges carried a moral compass we could trust. But then I sat in courtrooms in Toledo, in Amarillo, in Springfield. I saw men's futures decided in under 4 minutes. I saw people sent away, not because they were threats, but because they were poor. I saw judges share jokes with prosecutors, then sentence defendants to 10 years in prison for non-violent charges. And when I questioned it, I was told to be patient, to wait my turn. The audience at home shifted uneasily. In living rooms, older viewers nodded knowingly, remembering their own brushes with injustice. On social media, clips began to circulate within minutes, captions appearing. She's saying, "What we've lived?" Wexler chuckled. It was a dry, deliberate laugh, meant to suggest experience. Congresswoman, perhaps you misunderstood what patience looks like. Reform does not happen with hashtags and speeches. It takes discipline. Jasmine leaned in, her eyes steady. You are right. Reform happens when the right people stop making excuses. The tension inside Studio 4B snapped taut. No applause followed. It was not that kind of show. But the silence carried its own verdict. Monica tried to step in, her voice thin. Strong views from both sides tonight. But Jasmine raised one finger, not to silence, but to hold the moment. Her voice deepened. This matters. People are watching who have lost jobs, custody, freedom, not because they were guilty, but because they were easy to process. We speak of justice as if it were mathematics. But when those solving the equation bring bias into the formula, the entire system is rigged. For the first time, Wexler's posture shifted. He straightened, his jaw tightening. That is a very emotional argument. Jasmine answered softly. It is a human one. The control room froze, debating whether to cut to commercial. They did not. They sensed history unfolding. Wexler leaned closer, voice sharpening. Congresswoman, you speak as if you have ever had to weigh a victim's tears against a defendant's excuses. Sit on the bench with a grieving mother in the front row. Then tell me about bias. Jasmine did not flinch. Her eyes locked on his. I have sat with grieving mothers. Not in courtrooms, but in hospital rooms, in kitchens with eviction, notices taped to the door. I held the hand of a mother whose son was convicted because the jury was told he fit the description. I did not need a robe to feel the weight of her pain. A ripple moved through the studio crew, an audible intake of breath. For a moment, Wexler's smirk wavered. He tried to recover, but Jasmine pressed forward. I read your ruling in State v. Henderson. You denied a motion to suppress, even though the officer admitted there was no probable cause. You wrote that the defendant should have known better than to carry a weapon. You ignored the law because you did not like the man before you. Do not lecture me about facts and feelings. Judge, you blurred those lines long ago. The silence that followed was thunderous. The cameras caught it. The nation watched. In homes across Ohio, retired public defenders sat forward in their chairs. Law students replayed the clip in real time. Community activists whispered, "She said it for us." Inside the studio, Monica shifted in her seat. Sensing her role as moderator had slipped away, this was no longer a panel. It was an indictment. And across from her, Judge Wexler felt for the first time in decades the weight of accountability, pressing back. The silence in Studio 4B deepened. It was no longer a pause between talking points. It was the silence of a courtroom after the jury files back in. The silence that presses against the ribs and makes every breath sound loud. Everyone knew the exchange had crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer debate. It was reckoning. Jasmine Crockett did not raise her voice. She leaned back slightly, hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had learned long ago that silence unsettles men who believe they own the floor. When she finally spoke, her words rang with the gravity of a verdict. Judge Wexler, she said evenly, let us stop pretending this is a debate between equals. You left the bench with 37% of your rulings overturned on appeal. 37. That is not a statistic. That is a pattern. The number landed with force. In the studio, the crew exchanged glances, the weight of the revelation visible in their eyes. Monica Fields, the host, blinked as if she had misheard. Even the camera operator, trained to remain neutral, adjusted his grip. Across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Some wrote it down on scraps of paper to check later. Others grabbed their phones and began searching. Within moments, the number was already being repeated online. Jasmine continued before Wexler could gather himself. And those reversals were not about commas or clerical errors. They were about bias, about process, about your disregard for precedent, whenever it conflicted with your preferences. Wexler's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed the armrest once, twice, then stopped. His smile was gone. The mask of authority was slipping. In Murray v. State, Jasmine pressed on. You denied a motion to recuse yourself, even after it was revealed that you had shared drinks with the prosecutor the weekend before trial. The appellate court reversed you unanimously. Their words were clear. Your courtroom lacked the appearance of impartiality. That is their phrase. Not mine. Gasps whispered through the studio audience. At home, viewers snatched up phones, searching for the ruling. Screenshots began circulating within minutes. Hashtags sprouted in real time. Crockett vs. Wexler. Impartiality matters. Jasmine's gaze did not waver. I was a second-year law student when I read that opinion. I highlighted the line where you argued that optics should not override experience. You wanted the public to believe that your long record gave you the right to ignore basic ethics. If you could say that with a straight face, I wondered how many lives had you sentenced with the same disregard. The control room was chaos. Producers huddled, debating whether to cut to commercial. If we pull the plug now, one argued, we look like we are protecting him. The director shook his head. Keep it rolling. The nation needs to see this. Back on stage, Jasmine pressed further. You built your reputation on fear, but fear is not respect. You controlled your courtroom with silence, but that does not make it just. You silenced defendants, but that does not make them wrong. Wexler finally leaned forward, his voice raised slightly for the first time. I gave my life to the law. You gave yours to politics. And I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who has never had to balance a victim's tears against a defendant's lies. His words were meant as a blow, but Jasmine absorbed them without flinching. She met his gaze and answered with quiet power. I have sat with grieving mothers. Judge, not in your courtroom, but in hospital corridors, in kitchens, with eviction notices hanging on the door. I have held the hands of mothers whose sons were convicted because the jury was told they fit the description. I did not need a robe to feel their pain. The word spread across social media instantly. Clips were cut and reposted within minutes. Students in dormitories cheered. Families in small apartments nodded through tears. And even some former defendants whispered aloud to empty rooms. She is telling my story. Jasmine leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, but sharpening her words. Let us talk about United States v. Roosbelm. You imposed the maximum sentence on a man convicted of possession, not trafficking possession. Your justification was to set an example. That was not the law speaking. That was ego. The crew behind the cameras could not hide their reaction. One muttered, "She brought the receipts." Another whispered, "He is finished." Wexler's voice hardened. You are out of line. Jasmine answered instantly. You have been out of line for years. It was the kind of line people would quote for weeks. In the control room, a young technician mouthed, "Oh damn." Monica tried to interject, her cue cards trembling in her hand. Perhaps we should. But Jasmine lifted one hand gently, not rudely, but firmly. This matters. Her eyes bored into Wexler's. You once told a reporter that fear was a useful tool in a courtroom. Do you even hear yourself? You treated your courtroom as a stage. Your defendants as props. You sprinkled fear around like seasoning, reminding everyone that you were in charge. The studio was silent. Wexler shifted again, his face tight, his hands clasping and unclasping. He looked like a man unaccustomed to being challenged, suddenly stripped of the armor of unexamined authority. Jasmine's voice steadied further, gaining rhythm like a sermon building to its close. You punished the people least able to defend themselves. And tonight, those people are watching. They have voices, now phones, platforms, ways to be heard. This conversation is already bigger than you, bigger than me. She turned, just briefly, towards the camera. Viewers felt it in their bones. This was not simply a clash between two individuals. It was a mirror held up to a nation. I did not come here to humiliate you. Judge, Jasmine said at last. I came to tell the truth. If that threatens your legacy, perhaps your legacy deserves to be threatened. Wexler's mouth opened, then closed again. His practiced smirk, the mask he had worn for decades, had vanished. What remained was raw and unfamiliar. Frustration, perhaps fear, and across the country, millions of viewers saw it. When the cameras finally cut to commercial, Studio 4B exhaled, as if the oxygen had been held hostage. Crew members looked at one another, wide-eyed, as though they had just witnessed an earthquake. Monica Fields lowered her cue cards to her lap, her knuckles pale from gripping too tightly. Judge Roland Wexler sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, jaw clenched. And Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, simply folded her notes and waited for the countdown to resume. But outside the studio, the moment was already alive. In living rooms across Ohio, grandmothers shook their heads in solemn agreement. That girl, one whispered. She spoke the truth. They never wanted to hear. In barbershops and beauty salons, televisions replayed the exchange with laughter, gasps, And applause. Students on college campuses clipped the 37% statistic and posted it on social media with captions like, "Imagine failing this often and still being called honorable." I mean, within 15 minutes of the confrontation, the first clips hit Twitter. At first, they were short 16 seconds. 28 seconds, Jasmine's words about fear and respect condensed into bursts that spread like sparks. By the time the program returned from commercial break, Wexler Exposed was trending in 3 states. In the control room, producers checked their phones nervously. "It's everywhere already," one muttered. "There's no putting this back in the box." By midnight, it was no longer regional. The hashtag had climbed into the national top 10. Cable news shows replayed the confrontation in their late-night broadcasts, framing it as a rare moment of political courage. Anchors spoke of it as if history had unfolded live before the cameras. But the impact was not limited to headlines and hashtags. At 1:30 in the morning, Tanya Resnick, a former public defender in Ohio, opened her phone and typed through shaking hands. "Judge Wexler once told my client, 'You people need to learn what consequences feel like.' I filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Tonight, Congresswoman Crockett gave me something I never had in his courtroom, a voice." She pressed send. By dawn, her tweet had more than 78,000 likes. The next morning, law professors discussed it with their students. "This," one said, "holding up a phone with Jasmine's clip, is accountability in real time. We will be talking about this for years." Community organizers distributed the clip at rallies. Activists in churches replayed it on projector screens, letting the silence after Jasmine's final words hang heavy before congregations. By 9 o'clock in the morning, a panel of former federal judges debated it on Real Justice Now. One, visibly uncomfortable, defended Wexler as a man of principled toughness. Another shook his head. 37% overturned on appeal. He repeated slowly, "That is not principled. That is reckless." But the most profound shift happened not on television but behind the scenes. At 8:42 a.m., the Office of Judicial Ethics received a petition with more than 18,000 signatures demanding a review of Wexler's record. By noon, a law professor at the University of Cincinnati had submitted a 30-page brief outlining 6 cases where appellate courts explicitly rebuked Wexler's excessive judicial discretion. What had once been buried in legal archives now burned across front pages. And still, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She did not tweet. She did not gloat. She spent the morning in her district office, answering phone calls from constituents, listening to their stories. To her staff, she was almost serene. "Let others talk," she said. "Our work is not about noise. It is about truth." It was not until late afternoon that she spoke publicly. Not a press conference. Not a slick campaign video. Just a 2-minute recording on her phone, seated on a park bench outside the Capitol. "I did not go on that program to attack anyone," she said, her voice steady. "But when those in power speak down to the public as if they cannot be questioned, someone must remind them, power is not permanent, and power does not make you right." She never once spoke Wexler's name. She did not need to. Meanwhile, Judge Wexler scrambled. The following day, he appeared on a smaller conservative network, dismissing the backlash as social media hysteria. He leaned on the words he had used his whole career: discipline, restraint, tradition. But when the interviewer, a former prosecutor, pressed him, "If so many people feel mistreated by your courtroom, should we not ask why?" His half-smile faltered. His response, "People remember emotion, not context," only deepened the storm. By Thursday, judicial reform organizations called for a formal review of his tenure, not to punish, they said, but to document, to recognize the human cost of unchecked authority. Journalists unearthed old transcripts. Law blogs analyzed sentencing data. A local station in Dayton discovered that in more than a decade, Wexler had imposed maximum penalties in 89% of nonviolent felony cases. An outlier so extreme, it demanded explanation. Then came the letter. It was from the State Bar's Ethics Committee, not an indictment, not disbarment, but a formal notice of inquiry. They would examine not only his rulings, but his conduct outside the courtroom. For the first time, the man who once dismissed optics as irrelevant now found himself under the harshest glare of all, and through it all, Jasmine did not celebrate. She shifted focus to the people most affected. On Friday evening, in a modest community center in Akron, she hosted a town hall. No cameras, no soundbites, just folding chairs and raw testimony. Formés défendants, families, and public defenders shared their experiences. A young man, barely 23, stood hesitantly. His polo shirt was worn, his hands buried in his pockets. "I did 3 years for possession," he said. "No priors. Judge Wexler told me I needed to learn respect. I lost everything: my job, my apartment, my daughter's first words. Nobody listened when I said I was just scared. I wasn't a gang member. I was just broke." Jasmine listened, her eyes fixed on his. "You are not alone," she told him softly. That was her difference. She did not use their pain as a podium. She made space. Reporters, circling like vultures, kept asking her to strike at Wexler again. She refused. "It is not about one man," she told them. "It is about the mirror we have been afraid to hold up." 3 days later, Wexler issued his own statement. 1 page. No apology. He announced his resignation from the Judicial Ethics Advisory Board, citing a need to protect the integrity of the institution. It was a quiet exit, stripped of the pomp he once commanded. But silence could not erase what had been said, or what had been heard. In law schools, the Crockett-Wexler exchange was added to syllabi. Professors framed it as a lesson in public accountability. Students analyzed Jasmine's cadence, her command of silence, her mastery of facts. In community halls, activists replayed it for those who had never trusted politicians, saying, "Look," someone finally said it aloud. And in homes from Cincinnati to Youngstown, people who had once been invisible felt seen. Jasmine had not merely won an argument. She had cracked a wall. The week after the confrontation, headlines began to shift. At first, they had been dominated by Judge Roland Wexler, his record, his reversals, his downfall. But slowly, another story emerged. It was not about his fall. It was about her rise. Jasmine Crockett did not chase the spotlight. She did not book endless interviews or hold victory rallies. Instead, she traveled. Her first stop was Akron, then Toledo, then Cleveland. She walked into community halls with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. She sat in circles with mothers, ex-défendants, and public defenders. She did not stand at podiums. She sat among them, shoulder to shoulder. In one small hall, an elderly man rose with trembling hands. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I was sentenced by Judge Wexler in 1987. Non-violent. I did 7 years. When I came home, my children barely recognized me. I thought no one would ever care about that story. But last week, Congresswoman, you spoke my truth." Tears gathered in his eyes. Jasmine reached across, touched his shoulder, and said, "Your story matters, and it will not be forgotten." Moments like that defined the weeks that followed. It was not simply about dismantling one man's reputation. It was about collecting the fragments of countless lives scarred by a system and stitching them into a tapestry of testimony. Journalists began calling it the Crockett effect. Community organizers called it truth circles, meetings where people spoke openly of their experiences with courts and prisons. Often for the first time, these gatherings spread beyond Ohio. In Chicago, pastors replayed her words in Sunday sermons. In Atlanta, youth groups screened the clip and held discussions on fairness and bias. In Baltimore, former prisoners organized a town hall, holding up placards that read, "Fear is not respect." But Jasmine's vision stretched even further. She began hosting virtual dialogues that connected African American communities with voices from across the Atlantic. In Ghana, lawyers spoke of colonial laws still shaping courts. In Nigeria, activists described young men imprisoned for petty theft, while politicians embezzled with impunity. Elders from South Africa shared stories of apartheid-era judges who wielded the law as a weapon. Jasmine listened carefully, drawing threads between continents. "Our struggles are linked," she said in one call, "because injustice wears many uniforms, but its shadow feels the same. If we do not name it, if we do not challenge it, it will pass from one generation to the next, like an unspoken curse." Those words echoed widely. African newspapers picked up the story, portraying Jasmine not just as an American politician, but as part of a larger African diaspora movement for justice. Meanwhile, in Washington, her colleagues noticed the momentum. Some were wary, warning her not to become too radical. Others quietly admired her courage. A small coalition began forming around her lawmakers, pushing for stronger judicial oversight, transparency in sentencing, and reforms to mandatory minimums. It was not sweeping revolution, but it was movement. What distinguished Jasmine was not fire alone, but balance. She never let the moment become only about herself. She continually redirected the focus outward, toward the young man who lost his job over a bus delay, the mother jailed for missing a court date, the families broken by disproportionate sentences. She made it clear that accountability was not revenge. It was repair. At one rally in Cincinnati, a young woman stood up with a notebook trembling in her hands. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said softly, "I am studying law because of you. I thought the system was too broken for someone like me to enter. But when I saw you on that stage, I thought maybe I could fight too." Jasmine smiled. "Do not just fight," she said. "Lead. This work cannot belong to one person. It must belong to many." Her words were quoted in newspapers, replayed in podcasts, etched on posters. But for those who were there in the room, it was not about sound bites. It was about a permission they had long been denied. Permission to hope. As the weeks stretched into months, the Crockett-Wexler exchange began entering classrooms. Professors dissected it in law schools. High school teachers used it to spark discussions on fairness. Community colleges screened it in ethics courses. In one Philadelphia classroom, a student raised his hand after watching the clip and said simply, "That is what truth looks like when it finally speaks." Yet Jasmine knew the backlash was coming. Wexler still had allies, politicians, pundits, and former colleagues who called her emotional blank, divisive, reckless. Op-eds questioned whether she had disrespected the judiciary. Radio hosts painted her as a grandstander. But the difference was that Jasmine no longer stood alone. Each attack sparked waves of defense from ordinary people. Former defendants wrote letters to editors. Mothers called into radio shows. Students organized teach-ins. The narrative no longer belonged solely to those in power. And in that shift, something subtle but profound happened. The idea of accountability stopped being abstract. It became personal. For Jasmine, the journey was not about building a pedestal. It was about building a bridge between generations, elders, who had endured silent injustice, and youth, who demanded their voices be heard. A bridge between continents, linking the struggle of African Americans with the echoes of colonial courts in Africa. A bridge between law and humanity, reminding the nation that justice is not mathematics. It is mercy, clothed in fairness. In an interview on a small podcast called Everyday Justice, the host, Bernard Tollefson, asked her, "Why did you not strike harder? You had the whole country behind you." Jasmine paused, then answered softly, "Because this was never about striking. It was about holding the ground." That night was not about humiliating anyone. It was about naming what too many have carried in silence. There is a cost to always playing it safe. And when you have the microphone, even just once, you must decide whether to be comfortable or to be honest. Her words resonated far beyond the podcast's modest audience. Law students replayed them in dormitories. Community organizers transcribed them onto flyers. And in a halfway house in Dayton, a man who had just been released after serving a Wexler sentence sat still with headphones, tears on his cheeks, whispering, "She spoke for me." In that whisper, the future began to take shape, because the true measure of the moment was not the trending hashtag, nor the resignation letter, nor the news cycle. It was the way one calm voice had awakened thousands. It was the way silence cracked, and truth walked in. And so, Jasmine Crockett moved forward not as a hero sculpted in marble, but as a bridge of flesh and bone, carrying the weight of voices long ignored, connecting them to one another, and to a vision of justice that no title, no robe, no gavel could suppress. The lights of Studio 4B have long since dimmed. The cameras are packed away, the control room silent. But the echo of that night has not faded. It carries still in the corridors of law schools, in the pews of churches, in the quiet living rooms where families replay the clip on their phones and nod, saying, "Yes, that is what we have felt all our lives." Jasmine Crockett did not enter that studio to become a symbol. She entered as a servant of her people, as a daughter of struggle, as a woman shaped by the same forces that have weighed on countless lives. And yet, in the span of less than half a minute, she reminded a nation that power does not belong to those who claim it. It belongs to those who dare to question it. For decades, Judge Roland Wexler represented something that felt immovable: the cold authority of the bench, the gavel that silenced voices, the smirk that told defendants their pain was irrelevant. But authority built on fear will always, in time, meet its reckoning. That reckoning came not in a courtroom, not in a written opinion, but in the unflinching calm of a black woman who refused to be dismissed. The story did not end with a trending hashtag or a resignation letter. It continues each time someone finds the courage to speak, where silence once lived. It continues in classrooms where young people debate fairness. It continues in town halls where elders share testimonies long buried. It continues whenever someone says, "This system must answer to us," not the other way around. For those of us who are older, who have seen marches, arrests, and hard-won victories, Jasmine's stand is not a novelty. It is part of a river that began long before her, a river that flowed through Selma, through Soweto, through Accra, through Memphis, a river of memory, of sacrifice, of unyielding faith that the arc of the universe does bend toward justice, but only if we pull it together. Jasmine Crockett's voice joined that river. She did not claim to be its source, nor did she pretend to be its destination. She understood something deeper, that truth does not belong to any one person. It belongs to the people who carry it, who risk for it, who refuse to let it be buried under robes or titles. And what does that mean for us? Here and now, it means that silence is no longer an option. It means that when arrogance cloaks itself in credentials, it must be challenged. It means that when fear is used as a tool of control, we must insist on respect instead. It means that every courtroom, every chamber, every hall of power must be reminded that justice is not an institution. It is a promise to the poor, to the forgotten, to the broken, a promise that their lives matter, their voices matter, their truth matters. Jasmine Crockett kept that promise alive, not with shouting, but with calm, not with bitterness, but with clarity, not by humiliating a man, but by lifting the curtain on a system. That is courage, that is leadership, that is legacy. And so, as we close this story, let us not close our eyes. Let us not treat this as one dramatic moment that passed with the news cycle. Let us carry it forward, because somewhere tonight, another judge smirks. Somewhere, another defendant is told to wait. Somewhere, another mother sits at a kitchen table with an eviction notice and no one to hear her cry. But now, because of Jasmine Crockett, those cries have a witness. Those silences have an answer. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is the decision to sit still, to meet arrogance with steady eyes, to say calmly, "No more." That is what Jasmine did. That is what we must all do. In our homes, in our communities, in our nation. For power is not permanent. Truth does not wear a robe. And justice will never be silenced. Not as long as voices like hers remind us to listen, to rise, and to believe.